Okay, this is Canon Law II and Semi-Exile, Lesson 9, the historical and theological background of marriage. Yesterday we had the first half of the video material. That was November 2nd. Today's the 3rd, and we're hoping to complete it today. At the end of the last video, we finished up talking about Vatican II, Humanae Vitae, etc., and what some of the popes have done. Then Woodall, around 352, he has a section on biblical passages relevant to marriage, and I think it's good, so I think you should read that. What we'll focus on here is the so-called the Matthew acceptive clause, when Matthew says, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity, he commits adultery. And Woodall's treatment, I think, is very good there. He goes through saying what the two rabbinical schools, Shammai and Hillel, had said. Shammai saying divorce was permitted only for adultery. Hillel saying divorce was permitted for any offense. And he makes a good point that if the clause from Matthew, and again this is Matthew 19:9, if it meant that divorce was permitted for unchastity or for adultery, he would simply be siding with the school of Rabbi Shammai, and it wouldn't make sense in the context as to why people were astounded by this teaching. And it of course would be consistent with Mark. So what he is suggesting is that this word unchastity, porneia, this likely refers to marriages that were improper, probably because of marrying a relative who was too closely related, and those are marriages that, as we will study, those are invalid marriages. So it's not as much in our language a matter of divorce as it is a matter of identifying that a marriage was not possible there. So I think his treatment is good. I think it also will track what you study, probably have already studied in Father Christian's class, but if you have questions on that, we can discuss it. Good. Okay, and then and then we should talk a little bit about Paul, because his teaching in 1 Corinthians 7 is really the basis of the Pauline Privilege. And there the idea is that two people, unbaptized, get married. Then one becomes baptized, one converts, becomes baptized. And the non-baptized party raises obstacles to the Christian practicing the faith. And in that instance, what the Pauline Privilege is going to permit is for the Christian spouse to, if the other spouse really will not live peaceably with the newly converted Christian spouse, then the Christian spouse can depart, and the tradition is can marry someone else. And we'll talk more about that, but that kind of basis of what we call the Pauline Privilege is contained there in 1 Corinthians 7. The reason for that permission is it's called favor of the faith, and the idea is that if the Christian is kind of required to stay in this marriage where they have a hostile spouse, it's going to be bad for the faith of the Christian, and so he or she will be permitted to marry someone else to favor the faith. So certainly to marry another Christian, or possibly even another non-Christian, but one who won't be hostile, who won't raise obstacles. Okay. We talked a little bit in the previous video about marriage as a remedy for concupiscence. We have that from Thomas, but it is not mentioned in Vatican II. Woodall points out on 356, it's not denied either. And what he says is that Vatican II did not want to emphasize the use in corpus, this idea of use, I-U-S, in corpus, rights to the body. But he said Vatican II did not deny it either. It's more of a question of emphasis. And he says there is some truth in it. And I think he's right, because we do say if you're not able to, the idea of use in corpus was criticized because of being overly biological, for one thing. Maybe you could say overly contractual, too. But Woodall is sort of, I think, very helpfully cautioning us by saying, but there's a truth in the use in corpus, that if people are unable to perform the marital act, we say that they're not able to get married. If they're physically unable or even psychologically unable to engage in the marital act, if it's really a case of perpetual impotence, that is, impotence, unable to perform the act, and it appears that it's not going to be cured, it's not temporary, it's not medication or something like that, then that person with this sort of incurable impotence is incapable of marrying. So I think Woodall is somewhat helpful here in saying that we're not emphasizing this language of use in corpus, but we're not totally throwing it under the bus either, because there is some truth in it. Then Woodall talks about Ephesians 5, the famous wives submit to your husbands passage, and he just makes a good point here where he says this idea of submission, this is a Christian idea of submission. It's not a slavish type of submission. And again, I'm sure you've studied that probably quite extensly in Father Christian's class. But if you wish to discuss it more in our class, we certainly can do that. And then Woodall at 358 starts talking about the preliminary canons on marriage, and very wisely he begins with this statement that, when you're in ministry and you're counseling people, you certainly want to be welcoming, sympathetic, kind, but he says that's not enough. You also have to be just. You have to be just to people, and even if you're, trying to be nice, you can't give them inaccurate or wrong advice. That is an injustice to them. So, for instance, if there is a previous marriage in the past of one or the other spouses, that needs to be addressed. That's not something that can be glossed over, and that previous marriage might or might not be found invalid. So you certainly do not want to guarantee, this is an easy nullity case or something like that. We can talk more about things that you can say. You want to be very careful about assuring people that there's no problem with getting a decree of nullity in a particular case. You sometimes hear this in Catholic media. Somebody will call into a Catholic TV or radio show with a nullity problem, and one of the people answering questions might say, "Oh, well, I'm sure there'd be no problem getting a nullity decree there." I mean, I've really heard this happen, and sometimes the people giving this advice really don't know what they're talking about. So you want to be careful. The thing you need to do is to assure them that you are going to be with them. I'm your pastor, or I'm your parochial vicar. I'll be with you. I'll be there to help you. I can't tell you what they're going to do. I'm not the judge. This is going to go before the judge. But the main thing we can do now to maximize the chances of your getting the decree of nullity is to fill out the fill out the forms, especially the questionnaire, as thoroughly as we can. And when some facts come up, I can give you advice on emphasizing and highlighting those facts that may indicate possible nullity of the marriage. I can tell you these are things that generally tribunals look at. They'll be interested in that. Does this indicate a possible nullity? I can't tell you exactly what they'll decide, but these are the things we're going to be on the lookout for. And again, I'm going to be with you throughout this process. Okay, so getting into the canons, one of the first things that Woodall talks about is Canon 1055, Section 2, where he says, "A valid marriage cannot exist between two baptized persons without it being a sacrament." Very important principle. So here's how we'll do a little schema of that. If the man is baptized, got a little cross. The woman is baptized, she's got a cross. Then their marriage is sacramental. Their marriage is sacramental, if it's a marriage at all. Now, maybe they got married and they said, we're not going to have children. We're absolutely not going to have children. That invalidates the marriage, even if they're Christians. So it's not that it's not a sacramental marriage. It's not a marriage at all if they've entirely excluded the possibility of children. But if a baptized man and a baptized woman are in a valid marriage, that marriage necessarily is a sacramental marriage, even if they're not Catholic. Even if they married at City Hall, even if they got married at City Hall, if the marriage is valid, then it's a sacrament. So Canon 1055. It's good, some of these, especially these early canons, starting with 1055, going to about 1060 or 1061, they're all very important. They're not too long, I don't think, but very foundational, talking about what makes marriage, what makes consent, etc. So they're worth your time to spend time with those canons. Also, in the same canon, but in the first section, we have this mention that we talked about on the previous video of the bonum conjugum. The canon says the marriage covenant is of its nature ordered to the good of the spouses, the bonum conjugum, the bonum, the good of the spouses, the conjugum, and to the procreation and education of children. So here, in a way, Woodall on 359 kind of talks about this language of the bonum conjugum, maybe kind of standing in for Thomas's language of mutual help. And he's saying not to exclude Thomas's term, but to say this term bonum conjugum, the good of the spouses, that's even broader than mutual help, but it would include mutual help. This canon calls marriage a covenant. Some people really are very adamant, saying that marriage should be called a covenant but not a contract. Marriage also is called a contract in the law, and so there really isn't, at least in the law, this hard and fast embrace of the word covenant and disregard of the word contract. Really, both are used. Covenant would probably be considered a type of contract, very sacred, very important contract. So some people sometimes describe marriage after Vatican II as, well, this is when we start to talk about the covenant instead of talking about a contract. That probably is true, pastorally speaking, at least largely true. Canonically, legally, not as much. Still, probably covenant maybe is a preferable term, but contract is also still used. The next canon is 1056, and that talks about the essential properties of marriage. What really has to be there? Sort of the two most important things that have to be there for there to be a marriage, and what they are in that canon are unity and indissolubility. So indissolubility meaning permanence, unity, the spouses are united. We would also call that fidelity, or exclusivity. That it's an exclusive, faithful union. Okay, now a valid marriage is intrinsically indissoluble. Any valid marriage, even if the spouses are not Christians. Marriage, just in the natural state, natural marriage, even if it's not sacramental, is a good, and by its nature, it's indissoluble. So, but we say it's intrinsically indissoluble, meaning the spouses, once they marry validly, they cannot dissolve the marriage. However, in some situations, there can be dissolution, usually by the Pope. We also just talked about the Pauline Privilege. There's a dissolution there of a marriage that's not sacramental. To be sacramental, the marriage has to be between two baptized persons. If only one is baptized, it can still be valid, but it's not sacramental. Okay, so a valid marriage, even if not sacramental, still is intrinsically indissoluble. The parties cannot dissolve it. If it's sacramental, and if it is consummated, then it becomes both intrinsically and extrinsically indissoluble. We say extrinsically, meaning even the Pope cannot dissolve it. So here's a little schema, okay, on consummation. Now here we're talking about sacramental marriages. These are two baptized persons. So we have a baptized man, a baptized woman. They have not yet consummated their marriage. So we say that marriage is called ratified. That's why there's a little R up here. The marriage is ratified. It means it's a sacramental marriage. It's intrinsically indissoluble. The parties cannot dissolve it. However, once it is consummated, then it is called a ratified and consummated marriage. And then it is both intrinsically and extrinsically indissoluble. So even the Pope cannot dissolve it then. Consummation makes a sacramental marriage absolutely indissoluble. Whitall also mentions, and this is in the early canons, marriage has been raised by Christ to the dignity of a sacrament. So marriage, we say raised to the dignity of a sacrament. For most of the other sacraments, we say, in a sense, Christ founded the sacrament. Here we have marriage actually, of course, existing before Christ is incarnated, historically. So here it's marriage is already existing, and it's already a good thing, but it is something that he's going to raise to the dignity of the sacrament. Let's go back to when we said that the marriage that exists between two Christians necessarily is a sacrament. We said that, and Woodall then comes back to this, and he adds that this is the case even if the Christian communities that they belong to, let's say one's a Baptist and one's a Lutheran, they do not recognize the marriage as sacramental. Nonetheless, it is, if it's a valid marriage. What can prevent it from being a valid marriage? Maybe one was married before and is still bound by that marriage, that would prevent it from being valid. What else? We said excluding children. We're absolutely not going to have children. That makes the marriage invalid. But let's say we have none of those invalidating factors. We just have a Baptist man and a Lutheran woman, and they marry validly. They consent to a lifelong marriage, etc. That is a sacramental marriage, even if their Baptist and Lutheran communities don't see it that way. Okay, and as we just said, to be a sacramental marriage, you need two baptized people. If we take away, let's say we'll take away her baptism, if only the man is Christian and the woman is atheist, Buddhist, Muslim, then we do not have a sacramental marriage there. Sorry, this doesn't work too well here. So you need two, both parties have to be baptized. So a Catholic married to a Hindu, not a sacramental marriage. Valid marriage, but not sacramental. Okay, a good page to focus on in Woodall is 363. He's got several different examples of Catholic marries Jew, Methodist marries Catholic, Methodist marries Muslim, and it's a good exercise to be familiar with those examples. If you're comfortable with all those examples on 363, you're doing pretty well. Okay, well, how do we get a marriage? Since that's what we want to talk about. Canon 1057 is going to tell us what brings marriage into being, going back to the old winning Roman school, consent. We can say consent makes the marriage. Consent brings marriage into being, and we can see that in Canon 1057. Well, what's the consent, though? What are we consenting to? We talked about the 1917 code, talking about the jus in corpus, the sort of exchange of rights over the body. Woodall's idea that there's some truth to that, but that's probably not going to be our preferred language. What Woodall says on 364 and what the next paragraph of Canon 1057 tells us is that the object of that consent is mutual self-gift. We're not going to talk about rights over the body, but we're going to say mutual self-gift, though that's going to include the physical expression of love as well. Okay, and then we have a canon on consummation. We've just talked somewhat about consummation in 1061. Again, consummation is what is going to make a sacramental marriage between two baptized persons, is going to make it absolutely indissoluble. So consummation means that the couple has engaged in the marital act, but they have to engage in the marital act, quote, in a human matter, or humano modo. And what that means is that there hasn't been force, there hasn't been an overpowering of the woman by the man, and it's a conscious decision. It's willing. It's not someone is drunk and passed out, and the woman, say, is drunk and passed out, and the man engages in the act. That would not be considered humano modo. And again, we talked a moment ago about consummation. When two Christians marry validly, that's a ratified marriage, or ratum, R-A-T-U-M. Once they consummate the marriage, that is a ratified and consummated marriage, or we can say ratum et consummatum. So again, here's our little schema. Two up at the top, baptized man, baptized woman marry, but haven't yet consummated. That's a ratum marriage, M-R. But once they consummate, it's marriage, ratum et consummatum. So this one up here, the unconsummated but sacramental marriage, still could theoretically be dissolved by the Pope, just as a natural but not sacramental marriage also theoretically could be dissolved by the Pope. Okay, let's see. Okay, for consummation, if you want to see the kind of requirements of consummation, take a look at page 367 in Woodall. He lists the requirements there, essentially erection, penetration, and ejaculation of seminal fluid into the vagina. Those are going to be the three requirements. And he raises this interesting question: does contraception prevent consummation? This is not an entirely decided question. It's not totally settled. A good place to look is do you remember when we talked about common error? We had that one commentary from the Canon Law Society of Great Britain and Ireland. That commentary on this canon, 1061, also is quite good, and it essentially takes the position that, but really the question is the integrity of the act violated? Again, seminal fluid is supposed to, for consummation, is to be deposited. So if it is not, so if a barrier method of contraception is used, a condom or a sheath, then that would prevent consummation. So the Canon Law Society of Great Britain and Woodall really says the same thing. There would not be consummation. So if all of the marital acts were engaged in with a condom, they would say that would not be consummated. This is not a universal opinion. Probably it would be the majority opinion now. I think this has kind of changed really over the last 15 or 20 years, though, so it's something to keep an eye on. Hewells makes an interesting point in Pastoral Companion. He basically agrees with Woodall, saying there's no consummation, but he says that the Holy See, even though this could make the marriage invalid, or not invalid, but could make it unconsummated. So it could be a ratum marriage, but one that still theoretically is open to being dissolved. But Hewell says the Holy See, as a matter of course, will not give dissolution on this basis. And then another authority, Westman, he wrote a book with another canonist called Coall, called Special Marriage Cases. He takes kind of a similar position to Hewell's, but he says that the innocent party, if it was only one party who wanted to use contraception and the other forced it or insisted on using contraception, then the one who was innocent, who did not want to use contraception, he or she could possibly get the ratum marriage dissolved. That there would be a possibility of dissolution there. So okay. A question that comes up sometimes, and Woodall talks about it on 365 and 366, is about verifying internal consent. Consent needs to be internal. You truly intend to marry, but it needs to be expressed externally, expressed in words. And a question you're going to have as a minister, or it may have occurred to you already, is, well, how do I know? Yeah, the people say they want to get married, but do they really? How do I know that that one isn't forcing the other, or that one's family isn't forcing one or both to marry, or something like that? And that's definitely worth thinking about. I think the first stop, though, the first thing as a baseline assumption, is that we generally assume people mean what they say. So in that sense, you don't have to be overly on the lookout to, sort of be overly suspicious that people are saying something they don't mean, or are concealing something. But you still need to be aware and attentive. Well, what are you being attentive for? Especially signs of anxiety. This should be a very happy moment. I mean, it could be nervous, but usually sort of nervous in a good, energetic, happy way. If there isn't that, if it's more just if the anxiety and nervousness is much more predominant, a lot of fear, just the absence of the joy that you would expect with people about to be married in a matter of months, that's something to be alert to. What can you do? Well, you often will be meeting with the couple together. But you can meet with them one on one too. That can be very very helpful. And you'll if you do that, you'll probably want to meet with both of them one on one, so it doesn't look like you're just asking one spouse about the other spouse, and but also because you'll just get very possibly different information by talking to them individually, and you may find out there what you would not find out with the fiancés together, that one really does not, the other willing to go through with this, but really they do not want to do this. And you have a very, in a sense, a very important role there. You may be in the position of almost, in a sense, giving permission to the person either to put off the wedding or even not to get married. So look, if you're not ready for this, there's nothing that says you have to marry in 6 months. You can take 9 months, you can take 12 months or whatever. This isn't, you're not a train, you're not on a timetable here, and it can really be liberating for the person to kind of have that, you know, you're not telling them what to do necessarily, but saying, look, this is okay. This happens to people. This is a huge life step. You can take more time to think about it, and you may be just much more having that additional piece, be much more joyful about it in 4 or 5 months. So that can be, a very important role. And it's just something to be attentive for. You're certainly not in business to prevent marriages, but to be, you do want to, help spare people if they're, heading towards an ill considered or just not sufficiently considered marriage. Um, just a couple last points. The church really essentially does everything it can to try to assure that marriages will be valid not only in the church but also civilly. So that's also very important. That's why you're able to, according to state law, to be a witness of marriage, and one final concept you should be aware of, and this is in Canon 1061. It's called putative marriage. And what a putative marriage is, it's just a marriage that at least one of the spouses thinks is a valid marriage. So let's say you're married to someone and she internally has withheld consent. So she has not consented, so you're not really married because you've consented but she hasn't. There hasn't been a mutual consent, but you don't know that. Uh, that's a putative marriage. You sincerely believe that it's a valid marriage. So if at least one spouse thinks it's valid, it's a putative marriage. Now both spouses could think the marriage is valid, but could be wrong. Maybe one is or both are mentally ill, and so much so that, their conditions prevented them from fully consenting. That could mean that the marriage is invalid, even though they wanted to be married, but were just unable to consent. But right now they think that the marriage is valid. So that is also a putative marriage. Okay, I think that covers our background section, our lesson 9. So our next lesson will be lesson 10, which is on marriage. Marriage impediments, and we will look at that next week. Thank you.